I'd like to thank you all, first of all, for inviting me to chair. I think it's an excellent initiative, and I was delighted to see that it's going ahead online, even though we can't meet face to face. So I'm very much looking forward to today's session. I think we have till 10:30, so hopefully that will give us enough time. My role is not really to say very much at all, but just like others here, to listen, and maybe we can all have a little think about what we hear and put forward some questions. It's an excellent opportunity to hear. I see, you know, a few themes here that are quite diverse, and we mightn't actually have access to them but for this. And of course, it's great for people to be able to present, even if it's a little bit more challenging. It's a bit more challenging for us all through Zoom. I think we're all, I'd never heard of it 2 weeks ago. Perhaps some of you are more familiar with it, but it's great to have it. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Intesar, who is with us at the minute, from the Technical University in Dublin. And Intesar, I think you're going to talk to us about women's inequality in the Middle East and North Africa in relation to the Arab Revolution. So I'll ask you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Intesar Madi. I'm a PhD student from Technical University of Dublin. Today, I'm here to present a paper titled "Women Inequality: Insights from in the MENA region, Insights from the Arab Spring Revolution." I just would like to stop sharing the video before I start my presentation to let your attention focus on my slide. Okay, here is the presentation outline. I would start with some introduction, and then I will go through the problem statement and research motivation. And then I will discuss a little bit about the literature review, and I will go on the importance of gender equality. And after that, I will speak about the gender equality in the MENA region and gender equality issue and the Arab Spring, and then I will conclude my presentation. I have experienced 2011 uprising in my country, Libya, and in 2011, number of newspapers and news program described the Arab Spring as an Arab Spring for women, despite the fact that the Arab Spring was not a gender-based revolution. Worldwide, women and girls still suffer from a massive inequality, and most of us have some knowledge of the facts that women face double discrimination because of their age and their gender. And this research study focuses on the assessment of the research that examine women's role in the economic and social context and the application in terms of economic development in the MENA region. So this paper seeks to offer evidence on how the Arab Spring Revolution has contributed to raise awareness of growing levels of inequality in the MENA region. In the recent decade, the Middle East has been the scene of dramatic political events, wars, revolutions, and various attempts of redraw the regional political map. Given this context, several studies question the link between this political turmoil and the structure and the level of socio-economic inequality in the region. And the majority of studies has linked gender equality to the labor market. And as we all know, that gender equality is much broader concept than involving only on one concept, labor market. In this table, I have some of the literature review that I would like to use in my paper, and we have the most recent paper by Alwani and Stebany, which is about gender equality in the MENA region and economic development. And these two guides find a curve, linear relationship between economic development and labor force participate and women unemployment. Also, we have another paper by uh, Nazahat in 2016, and he studied gender inequality in the MENA region as well, and he studied the impact, or he find that the impact of gender inequality differs from country to country. And we have another paper is that about the roots of gender inequality, and which is by, I find it hard to read that name. So the majority of this paper in general find evidence that there is a positive relationship between gender equality and economic development in each country. Gender equality, why it is important for the whole country and the whole world. As we all know and believe that women's economic development promotes overall economic growth for the whole society. And this is evidenced by those countries around the world that have higher number of women participating in the labor market and in decision making. And according to International Monetary Fund report in 2017, the report states that women can make a significant contribution to the economic model in the country, and the gender discrimination leads to decrease the access of women in the labor market, which in turn decreases the economic growth in this country. If we see at this graph, we can see the state of gender inequality in 2020, and overall global gender gap is 69%. What this means? This means that there is a still 31 gap need to be closed globally. And the main important thing is that globally there is a massive improvement in health and educational, but there is a little bit improvement in economic development, while the political empowerment, we can see the absence of women in this sub-index across all the world. And here, if we can look in more details, this gap within the regions, we can notice that the Middle East and North Africa has the highest gender gap, which is about, I think, 39%, which is quite high compared to the other regions. And Western Europe has gender equality with 76%, which is the best region in the world. And if we look all at those straight line, we can of gender equality in the MENA region appears little changed since the revolution movement began around the start of 2011. And overall, the region's cumulative score increased more than 1.2%, implying that women's equality have improved, although it's not revolutionary improved, but better than nothing in this region. There is no country in the world where women and men have an equal opportunity or equal pay. In some regions, a large gap persistent in the number of males and females who are not enrolled in schools, employment, or in training program. And we can see that the gender gap in the Middle East has narrowed by 0.5 in 2019 and by 3.6, I think. It's not show the slide for me, in 2000, since 2006. And according to the World Economic Forum, this gap is projected to close and it will take 140 years to close. As we all know that women in this region face a limitation and challenges with regard to their basic rights. And some people believe that, and there's a different point of view among researchers with regard to this region. Some believe that the culture and the social barriers hold these women back from engaging in economic activity or participating in decision making. Others believe the religion has kept women back in this region because the majority of countries in this region are Muslim country, and so the religion put some rules and stricts on women. The other one believe that oil has played a critical role in increasing this gap in this region. As we all know that the Middle East, the majority of countries is mainly dependent on oil, and we all know that oil field is mainly dominated by men. So some believe is that this is the main reason why women, they can't, engaging in economic activities or in public life, because these jobs more related to men, not suitable for women. And if we compare here the global gender gap globally and in the main region, and we can see that women all around the world still fall far behind their male in economic attainment and political influence. In reality, women are still largely absent from the decision making and face considerable obstacles on their path to empowerment. And we can see that in this, the political empowerment in this region is only 10% compared to the global score, which is 24%. With regard to education and health services, this region has made massive improvement, but this improvement is not translated into economic participating or in economic activity or political empowerment. So this region is still need more and more to do in order to close this gap. And here, if we take as an example some Middle East and North Africa countries, and if we look at their gender gap, and if we compare this gender gap with the global level, we can see here on the left side, Tunisia and United Arab Emirates. Those two countries are among the countries that best performing with regard to this gap, and we can see that the dark blue line is the global gender gap, and the shaded area is the country global gender gap. And we can see here in almost the three of countries, the education and health sector are matching with the global score, except with Yemen. And with regard to economic and political empowerment, for example, if we take Tunisia, Tunisia has improving in political influence and economic empowerment. Also, we can note that in Saudi Arabia, there is a little improvement. Women started engaging in economic activity and start engaging in parliament and political life. While in Yemen, there is nothing with regard to political empowerment, and there is very low women participation in economic activities. And we can see here in Yemen as well, there is still far behind the global score with regard to education. And I think this some of research said that because, you know, women, they has a high level of child marriage. So the women get married at very young age. So this means that they have to leave a school and just staying home, looking after their family and house work. This table shows the global gender gap ranking in the Middle East in 2020, and this ranking included 153 countries. We can see that Israel has made the best performance country in this region with the score of 0.7, followed by United Arab Emirates, Kuwait. While if we see down of this table, we can note Saudi Arabia, Iran, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. They are doing, they are in the lowest ranking in the global rank, and Yemen is the last country in this ranking. As we all know that the Arab Spring has increased the importance of women equality, and since the Arab Spring started, women started to be awareness about their rights, and they keep asking about their rights, and they want to involve in political decision and in economic activities. And this is the main point of this paper, is to see how much the Arab Spring has been a net positive for women, or in other words, is what has the Arab Spring done for women in these regions. To summarize that, a global attention has been remain focused on promoting women's rights and eliminating discrimination. And the next generation need to break down the barriers that have held women back for their countries, and identifying and analyzing factors that are holding women back in the Arab countries are critical points need to be focused on. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Intesar. I think that gave us a very comprehensive picture of the different types of inequality, I suppose, and the different facets of inequality that are experienced by women in the Middle East and North Africa. I think we probably have time for a few questions, but I might kick off with a question myself. I'm just, you know, I'm very interested in this link, Intesar. Now, you may not have gotten onto this in your research yet, but I don't know, you know, can we compare? Obviously, every movement is different, but I'm thinking when there is a movement or maybe unrest or a conflict in other countries, we know in terms of gender equality that women's roles can change during that time. So women get involved in different activities over a period of unrest, and that can have lasting effects and lasting legacies thereafter. So I was very struck by, you know, you were talking about oil, which is one of the drivers of the economy, and the fact that really most of the employment is for men. And so this is all about, of course, gender inequality. It's about roles and perceived responsibilities and who does what. Is there any evidence that from the work you've done to date, you know, that the small changes that we've seen are attributable to the Arab Spring and to a changed perception within societies of women's role?
Yeah, I have noticed that, especially, for example, if you take Saudi Arabia, women were not able to drive a car or to engage in economic activity or even in public life. I think after the Arab Spring and this revolution, the country has started to think about this as a very real problem. And we can see now women in Saudi Arabia started driving cars, and there is a massive of law change around this country, and women started engaging in public life, economic activity, and in the parliament in this country. So I really, in this study, mainly I need to focus in Saudi Arabia as an example of this, because it's from the data I will find, you know, data available, and then oil is one driven in this country. And after the Arab Revolution, this country has changed law with regard to women. So I noticed some change in this country as well. And even in my country, we noticed that women started participating in parliament, and they are getting started their own economic activity. Although, you know, it's still in severe war and still struggle since 2011, but there is something changed. And I noticed that the society started to get awareness that women need to engage, and they understand the importance of women in participating in this life and this rules.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's very interesting, and certainly, yeah, certainly one to follow up then as you go forward.
Yeah.
And I think the changing legislation is very, very interesting as well, because
Usually in
legislative
this,
change has to come first.
yeah, usually in this region, in the majority of Arab countries, the role of women, if they are engaging in work, they just go to either educational system or the health system. They can work as nurse or doctors, or, you know, teaching in primary or high education. But there's no, you know, engagement in any, you know, other activity. For example, in oil, my country is mainly dependent on oil, and you don't find any women working in this field there. Or even if you study the oil engineering, you only find it dominated by men, this field. So the women just more study in health or educational or social roles.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Intesar. Anna Marika would like to ask a question as well. Do you want to go ahead? Hello?
Hi, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself.
Yeah.
Thank you again for the presentation. It's really interesting, Intesar. So my question is a little bit more about the present. So I'm not an expert on Saudi Arabia or any of this, so might be not the smartest question around. But recently they've introduced the allowance for women to drive, and they've also started banning certain restrictions for public life upon women. And I'm hearing mixed stories about this. So some see it as a great success that women are allowed to drive. Others mention that whilst this was introduced, the government also arrested several protesters, arrested several figureheads, and so I'm hearing mixed stories about what effect this has. Could you shed some light upon these recent developments?
Yeah, in the past, in Saudi Arabia, women, they are not allowed, to go out or to drive or to travel alone or, with a female friend. She much need has her dad or her husband, her son or her brother to go with her. And imagine in some families, they don't have brother or their dad has died or they're just women. So I think this change has helped women there uh, uh, a lot with regard to this, because the life in the Middle East or in Arab countries, it's very difficult, for women compared to, the rest of the world. Women, they can't, do anything alone. Even if you went to do some shopping, you need your dad or some male go with you there. So there are more restriction, I think, there. And I know now when they change this law, this helped women a lot and give them some freedom, and they are not feeling more restriction on them like what was before.
Thank you. That helps a lot.
Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much. Ian, do you have a question?
We can't hear you.
Sorry, I thought perhaps.
I'm on now. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can hear you now, Ian.
Yeah. So thanks very much, Intesar. I had a question listening to your answer to Niamh, and you were saying that a lot of the economies, obviously in the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia, are very oil-based, and that is a particularly masculinized sector of the economy. So that got me thinking that there are maybe two elements to it in terms of economic equality and economic participation. One is the sectoral profile of the economy. So you might have an economy which is dominated by men because it's dominated by male sectors, right? So that's one issue. But then you might have a particular gender gap in a particular sector. So you could imagine, for example, that is the issue in your sample of countries in the Middle East, is it just that the economies are based on traditionally male sectors, which are male in other countries as well, like oil? Or is it that in other sectors, which are more equal in other countries, that they're much more male in the Middle East, or both? I hope that makes sense.
I don't really get your question. Can you clarify?
Well, so the one issue is the distribution of economic activity across sectors. Okay, so oil is a great example. Oil is a really male sector in all parts of the world. Okay,
Yeah.
Even in Norway, I'd say the oil sector is mostly male. So if it's just an issue of the economies all being based on oil, then that's very different than if you think about maybe other sectors like law, for example. So law in Ireland, it's relatively equal. And it's a big part of our economy, and that's a different issue, is the distribution of participation between males and females in a particular sector. Is it worse than the global norm in the Middle East?
Yeah, I think Women's Voice has raised it as a result of the revolution, and traditionally there is a negative outcome when changes are made. but this is the problem, and I don't know how to explain this in more. But we are not, mainly stuck in with Saudi Arabia. We will take, some countries, but I just, mentioned Saudi Arabia as an, example, and the data will be available in this country. For example, Tunisia doing some improvement after the Arab Spring Revolution, and Tunisia is not an oil country. And the tourism there in Tunisia is the main sector in that country. But I will take your point in account.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks both. Does anyone else have a question? I believe you can raise a hand. I'm not sure I can see them here, but you can also just send us a little message, or I have a nice happy clappy hand that I can use here. So any signal at all. Okay, I'm not seeing anything or hearing anyone. I think we'll have time to come back to this, but we've been joined by a second speaker. So I think we might move on to our second speaker, if that's okay with everyone for now, and we'll have time.
Question, sorry.
Sorry, yes?
I'm trying to unmute her. Lucia, could you unmute yourself because we cannot hear you?
Hello.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, I'm supervisor of Intesar, and
yes.
I just wanted to kind of what we Niamh's point in terms of oil. We're moving towards that area because we have the data, and also because we're seeing all the current events in that sector and what could be the impact in terms of women and all the rights that has been developed. And back to Marika's point in terms of controversial outcomes, and in line with Niamh's point too, when there are processes of change, they're always a negative, or tend to be a negative effect for those people that are proposing those changes. So I wouldn't be that surprised that they're taking action against the heads of those revolutions, or the voices that are being raised, because they want to minimize them. But as a result of that claims, those changes have happened. And then the oil-dominated sector, the issue that we need to consider there is exactly what Niamh is talking about, male sectors. So there is where we have the problem. There is still this idea that there are certain sectors where women shouldn't be in, and where we are kind of derived towards education or social care, where we are always taking that role. We are the carers. And this is what we want to explore. So we will look at the Arab countries for those that we have accessibility. And then we will be looking as well to those developed economies to see if we find that connection too. But it's quite clear that our society have integrated women not that quickly, and we are quite new, like in terms of making a contribution, in terms of being able to work and being able to vote and being active. So we are kind of babies, I would say, in our role. This is what we want to kind of show as well, the difficulties for countries where you have those patriarchal type of societies, and how that progress might be even worse or even slower. Because again, as women in developed economies, we face many challenges too. And again, we consider that we're making progress. So we want to bring that light on what are the difficulties too for Arab women. So that was the clarification I wanted to make. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that, Lucia. And perhaps babies, but perhaps not. And we all know baby steps. In fact, we were talking to Intesar about her children before we started. Baby steps lead to great strides. Yeah. But for now, if we can come back to this, of course, and to Intesar's work on this. We move to Miss Edna Okine, I think, from the University of Strathclyde. it's great to see you. My name is Niamh Gaynor. I'm a lecturer in School of Law and Government in DCU. So Edna, I believe you're going to talk to us about environmental trust funds.
Yes.
Within Africa. So I'll pass over to you. You have about 15, 20 minutes.
Okay. Thank you for having me today. And I'm sorry I was late. For some reason, I thought it was 10 a.m. So I just looked at my email and I saw it, and I apologize for that. And thank you again for having me. Let me share my PowerPoint here. Good. Oh, thank you. So I just started my research, and today I'll be talking about the use of environmental trust funds as a tool for preservation and for local communities to be more resilient. I'm looking at case studies in Uganda and also Ghana. Uganda, because I did my master's research in shea butter industry. If you guys know about shea butter, it's another form of butter used within the confectionery industry and also in the cosmetic industry. It really helps with your skin. So I looked at how it helped local communities in terms of economic gain, social opportunities, and environmental protection. So, and I saw some findings in there in terms of the protection of the shea trees and how different avenues can be used to protect the shea tree and also preserve the culture. And my research right now is focusing on looking at how Scotland is using co-production with the tech sector to improve climate and environmental action within their communities. And I want to look at it in terms of how they use their third sector laws and practices, as well as environmental trust funds to promote this. Now, the idea is to look at it in both ways, to look at the third sector laws and to look at the environmental trust funds within this context. So, and to look at how the SDGs are facilitated within this. And also to look at how it promotes actions and interests and also strengthens the third sector regimes and laws within the Scotland. And also to find out best practices and compare it with different regimes if there is still time, so that Ghana can use it and other African countries can use it for the strengthening of their tech sector and also to promote community actions and community interest and participation, especially in environmental sector. So the overview is to talk about my research and also to look at environmental trust funds in Scotland and to look at two case studies, that is Uganda and Adwari Atuke is a community in Uganda, and also the Jamestown fishing community in Ghana, and also to look at how the trust funds can help preserve these cultures or these communities environmentally, socially, and even economically. So with environmental trust funds, the basic idea or the basic definition by the UN is that they are independent and legal funding entities that help to mobilize and blend collective actions for environmental purposes. Now, when I looked at a bit about the Scottish regime, there are a number of environmental trust funds that they have. And I define environmental trust funds as those that are specifically towards environmental protection and trust funds that can be harnessed for environmental protection. So here we have the Climate Challenge Fund, which is obviously for climate change actions. And we have the Scottish Landfill Community Fund, which looks at how communities that are close to landfills can harness funding to use as projects to protect their community and also their environment. And then there is the Circular Economy Fund, which looks at social enterprises, which looks at environmental aspects and also some social aspects in order to facilitate dragging away environmental damage from economic action. And then there is the National Lottery Community Fund, and then the National Lottery Community Heritage Fund, which both looks at getting funding from the National Lottery for actions within the communities. Now, from my initial research and overview, I can see that Scotland has brought about this funding specifically to help third sector, or charities as they call it, to gain funding, and also to start projects that are towards climate and environmental outcomes, as well as the preservation of heritage. And most of their heritages are within the environmental sector and biodiversity, preserving it in some aspects. So I found out that there is this collaboration between government and also the charities, and not also only the charities, but communities can come up, band together as a group and access this funding. Now, the idea of the research is to find out what are the legal aspects that accounts for this funding, what are the concepts and ambience within the funding, and who can access it, what they can access it for, and when they can access it. And also to look at accountability measures, because when they access the funding, do they use it specifically towards the project or action plans that they have applied for, or can they use it for different things which may affect the environmental action or projects that they want to do. So all of this will be within my research. However, for today's presentation, I'm just looking at how government has made access this environmental funding tools, which communities can harness or access to bring about projects that can help their communities and preserve their culture. Now, this is quite important, and I think it will be quite beneficial in Africa, for example. So in looking at my first case study, there is a community called Adwari Otuke. It's in the northern part of Uganda. Now, they have a lot of share trees. Now, share trees are very unique in that it has survived for decades and years, and it has been used for a lot of traditional purpose and traditional customs. Some historians say that the share trees, and when the share trees have share fruits, and the fruits you can make a butter out of it. And this butter can be used for the skin, this butter can be used for cooking. And some historians say that the butter from the East, which East Africa, which Uganda is part of, were even imported by Egypt in the ancient times for mummification. And there are some cultural aspects to the share butter that is used in the community. They use them for naming rights, they use them for marriage rights. And to protect them, there were ancient laws that says that when people die, or when their ancestors die, their spirits used to live, or their spirits live within the share trees. And the share trees can grow very tall, and they can live for more than 100 years. So it was said that the ancestors lived within those share trees. So people were advocated not to cut the share tree. If you cut it, there were traditional consequences to that. And also they said that people shouldn't stay under the share trees. Now, when I was doing my research, the non-traditionalists said that it was because the share trees were so tall that when you stay under it, for example, during a rainy season and there is lightning, you can be struck. So that was why they said don't stay under share trees. So there were many traditional customs to preserve the share trees, and the people's heritage, the people's customs were embedded within the share tree and the share fruits that they got from it. They identified with it at the northern part, and most of their foods were used the share butter. Now, and it was a great resource because they used it for economic purpose. Women who were sort of poor, or in those times, I can say that men married a lot of women. So women had to take care of themselves and their children. So some women used the shea butter as an economic resource. And even till now, when I went to Uganda in 2016, it was still the case. It was also a social resource in that women came together. They called their neighbors to come together and prepare this shea butter, and it formed a sort of social community within them. And also it preserved the environment and its biodiversity, because some of the farmers use the shea trees as a way to protect the crops they plant, so that it will shade them. So it has a lot of opportunities in there. However, during some parts in the 1900s, there was war in the northern part, and a lot of people, it was a civil war, and a lot of people were displaced. Now, when they returned home, because they were displaced and they lived in camps, there was a high number of unemployment. So they weren't able to find jobs. And there came the market for what we call the black gold, which was charcoal. Due to a limit of cooking resource, charcoal was the best resource for cooking, or is still the best resource for cooking for a lot of African countries, because it is cheap, because you can use it easily, and because it has been used so long that people are more comfortable using charcoal than even gas to cook. I remember when gas was introduced for cooking in Ghana, a lot of mothers didn't want to use it because, one, they were afraid of it, and two, they did not know how to use it for their traditional food. So because of the boom of this black gold, there were a lot of shea trees that were cut down to make charcoal, and it's reduced the number of shea trees within that area, and also it's impacted the biodiversity within that area. So then, but then during some parts in the 2000s, there was a lot of market for shea butter because of the health gain that was found in the cosmetic gain that was found, and also for confectionery products, because it was cheaper than using cocoa butter in chocolates and other sweets. So a lot of people started making shea butter for exports now, and using shea butter for different cosmetic resources. However, most NGOs came into Uganda for, let's say, 2 years, brought the women together in a cooperative, showed them how to like use shea butter and then export it. 2 years later, they left the women, taking away the market access that they brought with them. So it became an issue of, let's say, a hit and run. When the NGOs come in, they help a little and then they leave the women, and then the women are left again back to where they started. So there's an issue with NGO accountability. So this created another issue in that if they can't produce the shea butter anymore, then they'll go back to producing charcoal. All right, so that was the main issue within preserving the trees. In Ghana's case, there is a town, it's a fishing community in the Greater Accra region, which is the capital of Ghana. Now, the town has a long history of culture and let's say the preservation of the people. It was where some of the colonial masters came to build forts and other things. So the town in itself has a lot of history within in itself. And Jamestown is actually a tribe within Ghana, which is called the Gans, and I'm a Gan. So we are like a fishing community. The tribes and the community's livelihood is based on fishing. Now, over the years, because Ghana, Accra became the capital, the population increased. And when the population increased, it impacted the economy and impacted the livelihood of the people in Jamestown. To add to that, there was a lot of issue with waste. When plastic was introduced, a lot of people dumped their waste in water bodies. And this water bodies, it was linked to the sea, especially at the part where Jamestown is. So there was a lot of plastic waste that was found at the seashore. And also, because of the population increase and because of some social issues, there were not a lot of convenient areas to excrete human waste. So some of the people, even within the communities, and also people away from the communities, started dumping human waste around that area. So it developed a lot of waste, both plastic and human, and it also impacted the fishing within that community, which digressed the economic impacts of that community. It's also affected the water and also how much fish they will get. It's also affected their social way of life, because now they couldn't, usually after, or in the past, after they go fishing, when they get a fishing boom, the neighbors come together, they play songs, they tell stories, and it's formed a sort of social cohesion after that. But because of this waste and any parts of fishing, they did not have the time nor the joy to go back to what they were used to. So it impacted them very much. Now, the government tried to manage the waste in that area, but because of funding issues, and also because of lack of understanding and lack of education, it has not been able to properly manage the waste at that area, or within that area. Now, the government decided that they were going to charge the people within the Jamestown area in order to come and collect the waste there. However, these people are, in a sense, poor, and they cannot pay the government in order for the government to come and take the waste away. So there is always this increase in waste. And because the sewaging system has not been properly managed and properly constructed, most of the waste again ends up in the sea and ends up within that area. So government management of this has been quite poor. NGOs have come again to try and help, but the situation is so huge that when they come, they just try and like promote their NGOs and themselves, and then they leave the communities as it is. And there is no lack of any accountability in there. Now, Ghana recently introduced 2 different types of environmental trust funds within the electronic waste management area and also mining area. I am yet to have a look at it to see whether third sector or even local communities can come together and access this funding to create projects within their communities. However, this shows that Ghana is on the right track to bringing about environmental trust funds, which can be used and harnessed for projects. Now, so the idea is that looking at how Scotland is using environmental trust funds and also cooperating with third sector and community groups to access this funding to create projects that are beneficial to their community, that are beneficial to their culture, that is beneficial to their environment, and that is also beneficial in preserving their local communities. This, if applied within Ghana and the Jamestown area, and also in Uganda within their Dwari-Otuke area, it might create some possible benefits in that the people can come together, draft a project which brings together local knowledge, which puts together what they want for their community, so that at the end of the day, they can bring about a project that will preserve, let's say, the shade trees, that will preserve their culture. And also looking at the Scottish case study, there is some form of accountability in that the funding is not given one time. The funding is divided into different stages and portions. So although you can get, let's say, the funding from your application, they will look at it in terms of what you've been able to achieve before they will give you more. So in this, it's hoped that it will help create some form of accountability within the project, and that people will not use it for different purposes, and there will not be a lot of corruption in terms of the use of the resource. Now, the issues that will be raised is education. We are talking about creating projects that are facilitated by funding. Now, before this can happen, the people need to be educated the people need to be given the opportunities and capacity in order to draft these projects that can be used. And also one of the main issue is also how can they do it? That is where I think my research comes in looking at the case study of Scotland and probably maybe comparing it with different regimes. I can find best practices that can be used within African's context. Now, another issue that comes in play is policy transplants. Now, there are a lot of policies that has worked in the northern parts or the developed country that has failed in developing in the southern part. So one of the main issue is after having found the best practices, we look at how the policies can be tailored to Africa's situation so that it can be used effectively within that, which brings about the adoption of the concept of co-production. Now, co-production is a concept that looks at service users working with service providers in order to bring about better service, for lack of a better word. So in that, we look at how the concept or the theory of co-production can be used within Africa, can be used within these two case studies, which is Ghana and Uganda, in order to facilitate a good project, in order to facilitate community action, and in order to facilitate social, economic, and environmental preservation. And I think that's the end of my presentation, and thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Edna. That's a very interesting project, and two fascinating cases there. So we do have time for questions from people. I do have one question myself, Edna. So you mentioned that in relation to the Ghana case in particular, so you mentioned that the government has tried to bring in some initiatives itself, but that it was hampered a little bit by, well, perhaps a lack of education or understanding on the part of local communities. But the first thing you mentioned was a lack of funding, or a lack of finance for this. And of course, this is where your own project comes in, and the idea of the link between the Scottish funding and local charities. But of course, Ghana, as we know, and I'm sure you know, is one of the fastest growing economies in sub-Saharan Africa, and is actually quite a wealthy country, and big oil revenues now as well. So I'm just wondering about that and the claim that the government doesn't have the money, because sometimes governments do, but maybe not a commitment. So that's one question. And my other question then is, what would, if this is brought about through a local charity or an NGO, what do you feel it would do differently or have to do differently for this to be successful compared to the government's initiatives that have gone before? And I ask this because you talked about the need for accountability on the part of charities. You use the term hit and run in relation to NGO accountability. And we all know that this is a huge problem, whereas they can come, they can go, there are short-term funding cycles, governments are in place, they might change, but there's always one there for a much longer term. So that's just two questions I have. One about the government's claim to have a lack of resources, and secondly, what a local charity or NGO might bring to this that the government itself could not do.
Thank you for your question. You did mention about Ghana being one of the fastest growing economy in sub-Saharan Africa, and oil boom and other resource avenues. However, that is the main issue. The outside world sees it as the fastest growing economy, but the local communities are not impacted by it. They don't feel that boom, that world boom, because for some extent, the government may have a lot of projects running and they are using it maybe for different things. However, it's not trickled down to the local community. It's not trickled down to the people. And the people do not have access to it. And as you know, one of the disadvantages of politics in most African countries is corruption. They may have provided the resources, but the local government may not have allocated the resources to what it is supposed to be used for. So that is one of the main issues. And I think that is why I am proposing using the element of the tool of environmental trust funds, because one, the trust funds will be embedded in law. Two, the people will be made aware that there is this portion of money placed aside for environmental and climate projects, which you can access, right? So even if there are a lot of projects that are around, it's up to the community to bring about a project that is feasible, a project that can also be beneficial to their community. It must not be, or it may not be a big, huge project. However, from one of the projects that one of the NGOs here or charities did was, it just helped people to learn how to cycle. That was just like a small project, but then it decreased, let's say, carbon pollution in terms of the using of transport. So I believe that in the use of environmental trust funds, the monies can be, the allocated fund can be transparent, which will trickle down to the communities. And for the second question, in terms of what the charities can do better, and this is the issue of hit and run, the idea is that since this environmental trust funds looks or will aim at funding local community projects, the community should be involved.
Yeah.
And there will be more transparency in that if an NGO decides that, okay, we are going to bring about this project, there should be a link that, okay, is the community aware? Is that community, how would that community, let's say, see what you are doing? So there will be more transparency. And also there will be, I believe, some form of accountability in that the money or the funding will not be given. I think that was one of the issues with Ghanaian projects, is that the money is given, or the funding usually is put all at once, and then people misappropriate it. So if there is checks and balances in how and when, and evidence of how the funding is used, it will bring about better accountability. Now, I'm not saying that the use of it will solve everything, but it will help a little in trickling down the wealth boom to the local communities. And it will also bring about some transparency and accountability.
Very good. Good. You make a convincing argument, Edna. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I open to other people? Have other people questions? Perhaps we're not a huge group, so if you just turn on your mic and tell us your name and go ahead with your question.
Lucia again. So thanks. I have a question regarding corruption and also the issue now in terms of being an oil producer. Again, back to my own area of research, like oil appears to be a curse specifically for those countries that are developing. While you make a convincing point, as was mentioned by Niamh before, in terms of the importance of different organizations and charities, what would be your views regarding the government approach and that the country would be able to cope with those issues, again, around raising level of corruption, use of resources in a wrong way, and the implications for the research that you're conducting? Thank you.
Thank you. I hope I got your question, or I'll answer it correctly. Well, when it comes to corruption in most African countries now, it has been an ancient and long life issue that I don't think one research or one person has the answer for it. Now, with the oil in Ghana, I think that is one of the issues I raised. Ghana discovered oil. The people were happy. Afterwards, the people did not see the economic impact of the oil. The politicians and the people in government were able to feel the impact in that they got the wealth or the chunk of it, but the people did not get a chunk of it. And that raises the question of transparency and also accountability. And I think that that is where probably the environmental trust funds may work or may improve the situation. In that, if government is able to bring out a policy or a funding bucket, if you may, and put a portion of that money within this trust fund, which can be accessed by the local community, it may reduce that form of corruption, and it may reduce the lack of transparency, and the resource can be used better than it is being used as at the moment. Because, for example, when it comes to participation in Ghana, the only participation that people are aware of is elections. That is when you can say the citizen participates in government, in governance. They go to the poll and they vote. And if you are aware, most African countries, when it comes to election, is marred by a lot of political issues, including violence. And mostly, sometimes they come and say, okay, the election was rigged and other things. So a lot of citizens are not actually participating in governance. And therefore, that brings about more corruption, that brings about more lack of transparency, and that brings about the misuse of resources. So my case is, if the people can participate within governance a little, even in this aspect of environmental and climate action, then it may improve the baseline that we have right now. I hope I responded or addressed the question well.
Thank you, you did, but just a point. You mentioned like the trusted funds to be kind of enabled by the government. So my thinking would be to look maybe into countries where they have had a successful approach.
Yes.
And then what has been the intervention? And again, who managed? Because I agree with the transparency and accountability, but if you leave the money back again to the government or authorities that you know already are involved in corruptive practices, then that won't be much helpful in trying to progress this. So I will be curious about how your research then is going to be feeding or is going to be supported by those approaches that other countries has followed and that has shown a little bit success.
Sorry, please continue.
That was all. Thank you.
Okay. I wanted to comment on that because you are right in that, and that was one of the issues I will also look at. And my initial look at the Scottish regime, that's why I particularly chose Scotland, because the Environmental Trust Fund, as we look at it now, is autonomous to the government. Although the government has set out this trust fund, it is embedded in a legal, let's say, law. The Climate Challenge Fund, for example, has an autonomous body, which has nothing to do with government. The only thing government does is to provide the funding, at least with what I have initially discovered. And then that body is what facilitates or helps in the distribution of the fund for the project. So I think you are right, and I'll compare Scotland's case study with other countries to see if there are better approaches. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Any other questions? We have a little small bit more time. Okay, I hear a pause if one can do that. I just something that comes to mind just listening to you talking there, Edna and Lucia. It's perhaps not directly applicable, but of course there is, you know, we're talking about oil, we're talking about revenues, we're talking about, you know, in a broader sense, what's, you know, often called the natural resource curse. So this phenomenon where countries that have an abundance of natural resources, whatever it might be, in my own research, I've done research in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, which is replete with natural resources, and yet extremely unequal country with people, many people living in dire conditions of, you know, abject poverty. But if we're to look at that and we're to think of a case, as you say, Lucia, which is a very good idea, to look at, well, where does this work, or where might this work, or where have we evidence that it works better? I'm just thinking, we often think of Botswana and diamonds. And the diamond industry there has very much benefited the local population. So it's an interesting case to examine. And one of the diamond industry and the oil industry, something that we maybe sometimes forget is we need to look at the international dimension to this as well in terms of accountability and transparency. There are international oil companies who are doing deals with national authorities, and quite a bit of that revenue is not perhaps sitting in the pockets of your national level politicians, but is leaving the country altogether. And that's something that the Botswanan government did differently. They signed an agreement with De Beers, the diamond company, which was very favorable to the Botswanan people themselves, in that a lot of the revenue was actually kept within the country. So that's just a thought I have on that. And the reason I asked my question in the first place is we often have NGOs coming in and almost sidelining the national government. So you are almost by default saying, well, it's okay for you to use your oil revenues whatever way you want. We will bring in this additional money and try to build local accountability using this. But there has to be a link then. How will that feed into building accountability and reducing corruption within governance within the country more broadly? So that's where I was going with that question. It's a long commentary rather than a question, but I don't know, Edna, would you like to react to that?
I think from what it really impacted me from what you said, it's similar in Ghana's case, in that the oil revenue, let's say the deal made did not help. It didn't trickle down. And as you said, it may be true that it is sitting in a lot of individual pockets, and the people have not been able to benefit from it. So I think from what you said, then the idea will be to look at Botswana's study and try and see how they use it and how Ghana can also use it in terms of environmental trust funds, and so that it will improve, let's say, accountability. And I was dabbling with something where instead of, let's say, as you mentioned, NGOs sidelining the government and starting their own projects, which they do a lot, that there will be, this trust fund may be an avenue for the NGOs to allocate their funding or come under that trust fund, so that communities that can use the project or the funding or the area that they want to impact can apply to. So then there will be more transparency in that the NGOs will be able to impact communities well. Communities will be able to also access this funding as it's relevant to them, and will be able to track what the NGOs are doing and what government is doing. So that government can show that we've done this, NGOs have done this.
Okay.
And this funding is used in this purpose.
Okay. Great. Sounds good.
If I may interject with another quick question. So my question is a little bit related as well to the research that was presented earlier by Intesar. And she spoke about this gender gap that you saw in women in the Arab Revolution. And I was wondering if we compare that to the research that you're doing to create resilience and financial resilience in a sustainable way, how can we ensure that this resilience is created equally, that, you know, men and women can have similar rights, can both take care of their families and of themselves. How do we ensure we are not creating a gender gap there?
Good. Thank you for your question. And I find that to be quite relevant for this project that I'm doing, as in, it looked at a lot of issues, and I'm like, okay, you should limit yourself and not go too far. Because there is the gender issue also there, as you've already mentioned. But I think one of the key ways that can facilitate that is there may be a recommendation of quotas. So in terms of projects, we can look at how many women are participating within this project. Mm-hmm. And what kind of quota, putting down a quota so that the women can have access to it. Because what I found is that if there is a funding for a particular purpose and people find out about it, they go ahead and they try and apply for it. So if under the funding, there is a part where it says that this is for women's groups, or groups where the majority are women, or NGOs that facilitates projects within the environment that are towards women empowerment and capacity building, then the women can access it. So from what you've said, then it will be interesting and it will be good if this is to be translated into the case of Ghana, for example, that from the onset, there is that quota that is set so that women can participate from the beginning. So this, I think, for now, may help to reduce the gender gap. But in the case of Adwaro Tuke, the shea butter case that I mentioned, most of the processing is done by women. So in that case, if it is the preservation of the tree through shea butter processing, and within the shea butter processing, the tree is not cut down for them to process it. And my case study showed that there were a lot of economic impact on women's cooperative and women's life through that production. So if that happens, then in that case, women will be helped a lot and it will impact women. But the issue therein is that the women within that, the shared trade, I forgot the word for it, within the shared trade industry, the women are at the basics, at the bottom. So even in the shea butter industry, it is the men that gain more than the women. So that can also be an issue in there. So thank you for your question. And I hope to address it as I go on with my research.
Yeah,
and hopefully you can give me some ideas and pointers.
Very few, but it sounds very interesting, definitely, because it's a great opportunity, I guess, to reduce a gender gap from the beginning. So I hope you can address it.
Thank you.
Thank you both. And I suppose that relates to the broader question when we talk about resilient communities, who is the community? And of course, communities are ridden with inequalities across all kinds of levels. Gender equality is one. It can be class, it could be ethnicity. So I suppose, yeah, what we're saying is to look at that very carefully. You said yourself, who can access the money? So who is accessing the money within the community? And is that exacerbating inequalities at different levels, or is it actually reducing them? So that's an important thing to factor in, I suppose.
Thank you.
We are almost out of time. I might just invite, is there anyone else who has a pressing question for either speaker? Okay, I hear a silence, in which case I think we'll thank both speakers. I think they were both fascinating interventions. There are a lot of overlaps between them, but both focusing in different regions. But of course, as we know, particularly today, given our circumstances, we live in a very globalized world, and the issues that people face in different regions are very similar. I think, you know, I certainly enjoyed both papers. I wish you both the very best of luck with the research as you go forward. And I'd like to thank everybody else for being involved and for participating, and to thank the organizers for asking me to be involved as well. I've hugely enjoyed it.